The Soviet War in Afghanistan, a bloody, drawn-out conflict with hundreds of key figures fighting in a Game of Thrones-esque struggle for dominance, the ramifications of which would eventually lead to conditions favorable for the rise of Islamic tribal warlords, a continued civil war and insurgency, and a geopolitical mess. But before leaping into the aftermath of the war, before looking at the military campaign, we must first look at the reasons and circumstances for the start of the war. It's 1973. King Zaire Shah of Afghanistan rules the nation, a poor landlocked country east of Iran that relies primarily on agriculture. The king's cousin and former prime minister, Mohammed Daoud Khan, orchestrates a successful, mostly bloodless coup while the king is away. He accomplishes this with the backing of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, powerful communist party. Daoud installs himself as the first president of Afghanistan, but he can hardly be referred to as a communist. Meanwhile, the PDPA that had supported him fractures into two groups due to infighting: the Parcham, who support a more gradual move towards socialism, and the Kalakis, who encourage more immediate radical reforms. Daoud acts as a semi-secular leader, and his administration, despite being suppressive and controlling, slowly leans away from socialist principles and champions progressive policies in a move towards the West. This puts him in an awkward position, with Islamist groups growing resentful from the government's turn away from Islam, and the original communist factions, which saw this as a betrayal of their values. Daoud is able to successfully suppress both groups, until he is linked to the assassination of a Parcham leader, which rallies the communists against him in the Saur Revolution of 1978. Afghan communists, having brought support of military commanders, stormed the palace on a Thursday and killed Daoud and his brother. The leader of the coup, Nur Muhammad Taraki, a hardcore communist and leader of the Kalakis, declares himself leader of Afghanistan. He proceeds with socialist economic and social reforms, which proved to be tremendously unpopular. A land reform deal in which land is violently redistributed from landowners to rural population results in a rapid plunge in agricultural harvests. A strict prohibition on loans without a sufficient replacement system further damages relations with the peasantry. Additionally, Taraki makes strong attempts to transform the country into a Stalin-style police state. Prior Afghani administrations lacked strong enough central government to enforce political and civil repression. This changes under Taraki's government, where over 27,000 political prisoners are executed by the communists. Taraki and his close friend and fellow Khalid member, Hafizullah Amin, continue implementing communist policies, declaring women as equals to men and cracking down on Islamic movements. All this time, the Islamic groups, who had simply disliked Daoud, are seething at Taraki and Amin's policies. It doesn't take long for them to reorganize themselves into rebels. Now enter the next player, the Soviet Union. Leonid Brezhnev, head of state in the USSR, promotes Taraki and Amin's regime, though he is weary at the high speed at which Taraki and Amin integrate socialist policies in the nation. Taraki requests direct military aid from the USSR to deal with the Islamic unrest, but is rejected, with one Soviet Politburo member saying, "We carefully studied all aspects of this action and came to the conclusion that if our troops were introduced, the situation in your country would not only not improve, but would worsen." The Soviets urge a slower transition to socialism and suggest widening the base support for the regime, though they do offer large amounts of tanks and weaponry. Taraki and Amin ignore these ideas and proceed with their disastrous land reforms. And in 1979, this triggers an uprising in Herat, and the rebels, mainly poor rural farmers, successfully take the city. Taraki orders a division of the Afghan army to put down the uprising, but this division, that had had only a few Khalid members, joined the rebels instead. Taraki and Amin respond mercilessly, sending 2 armored divisions, which obliterate the rebellion. Throughout all of this, a growing rift develops between Taraki and Amin, with Amin believing Taraki had begun to believe his own propaganda and had become megalomaniacal, and Taraki believing Amin had too much influence with the Afghan army. Torki, with a little Soviet assistance, launches an assassination attempt on Amin, which fails. Immediately after, Amin uses the army to arrest Torki, after which the Soviets abandon him. He is subsequently suffocated with pillows, having ruled for less than a year. Amin takes over and becomes PDPA leader in what is an increasingly difficult situation. The anti-communist rebellion continues to grow, and the Soviets are distrusting of Amin, who they suspect of being a CIA agent. Amin's attempts at curbing the growing Islamic currents prove unsuccessful, and by this time, most rural provinces are completely controlled by the rebels. A key decision needs to be made within the Soviet government. Amin would be replaced with a more easily controlled Soviet puppet, that much was clear. But what effect would a military reaction have? They had already denied military aid to Torki's government before. The geopolitics of their decision are complex and less than clear. The more obvious reasons include pressure from encirclement from so-called US allies. Moscow, worried that the United States, having recently opened diplomatic relations with China, had a strong ally in the south. They had also underestimated to the degree to which Iranian and US relations had been damaged, believing the Americans to still possess some degree of Iranian support. So Afghanistan is the last Soviet-supported region in the area, and the Soviets weren't about to let it fall to Islamic rebels. In truth, however, the Iranian relationship had all been but destroyed by the revolution, and US-Chinese relations never grew into a geopolitical alliance. After several attempts to assassinate Amin, including poisoning and sniper fire, the Soviets intervene in Afghanistan on December 24, 1979, and assault the palace in compliance with Operation 333, the Soviet plot to depose Amin. Russian Spetsnaz battalions immediately overwhelm the defense, and Amin is killed, having only ruled for 3 short months. The new government, now completely under the control of the Soviets, installs Babra Karmal, a member of the Pacham faction, which had previously been suppressed by the Khalid government. Soviet forces move out into the region in an attempt to stabilize it. The USSR is now a direct participant in the Afghan Civil War. Many Afghans see the invasion as an occupation of Islamic land by godless foreign forces, and popular support for the Islamic rebels surges dramatically. These mujahideen engage in guerrilla-style warfare with the Soviets, and the situation becomes nothing short of a bloodbath. Several factors influence foreign aid to the rebels, the most controversial of which is the US funding of mujahideen forces. From the United States' perspective, this was a Soviet incursion into Middle Eastern territory, meant for expanding Soviet borders or strengthening their hold over the region. In the war, they saw an opportunity for payback in the Vietnam War, where the Soviets themselves had funded and aided North Vietnamese rebels indirectly. In a quote from Zbigniew Brzezinski, geopolitical advisor to the White House, "Our goal was to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as possible." President Carter authorizes the CIA-backed program Operation Cyclone as a counter to the invasion. Starting with a sum of $30 million per year, the CIA would allocate various quantities to different mujahideen factions. However, would the Americans personally train and arm all these rebels? No, this was not because of some brilliant foresight, but rather because of 2 pragmatic reasons. The first reason being that the CIA had feared becoming directly involved and being blamed like they were in Guatemala. In fact, the CIA had only a total of 10 operatives on the field. The second reason was that the American connections in Afghanistan were weak, and it became difficult to know who and what to fund. They needed an intermediary, someone who knew the factions and could advance anti-Soviet interests. This was Pakistan. Pakistan will soon be revealed as the most important funder, trader, financier, and overall supporter of the Mujahideen. But before we examine Pakistan's contribution, It is important to understand these stories are never simple, and that the United States was not the only one to allocate funds. Saudi Arabia matched every US dollar and eventually exceeded them. India funded Ahmad Shah Massoud and his Mujahideen faction. Pakistan, Iran, China, the United Kingdom, Egypt all funded the Mujahideen. Even Czechoslovakia, which was susceptible to material incentives, gave Soviet arms to the rebels. Brzezinski even mentions being able to secure weapons from the occupying Soviet army, which had become increasingly corrupt. And in the middle of this is Pakistan, ruled by Mohammad Zia. And all of this foreign funding is funneled into his Pakistani intelligence apparatus, ISI. Because of this, Pakistan has complete control over which Mujahideen factions are funded and which are not. Now, there were many factions of Islamist rebels, but the two key figures are Ahmad Shah Massoud, an ethnic Tajik and a moderate when compared to other groups, who received very limited funding from ISI. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, an ethnically Pashtun religious zealot who likely spent more time killing other Mujahideen and civilians than Soviets. Initially, he had the most limited operations in the region, so Pakistani intelligence believed he could be easily controlled and would have to rely on them. As such, he was fully funded by ISI, while the Americans and Indians had shown a preference for Massoud. President Zia of Pakistan believes that his country could control the fate of Afghanistan and all the while display its importance in the Islamic world best by funding the most Islamist militants, in this case the genocidal Hekmatyar. In all this time, Saudi Arabia encourages a pan-Islamic movement where foreign Muslims dubbed Afghan Arabs would come and fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets. Among them is a young, wealthy Saudi, Osama bin Laden. The number of different interests in the conflict is nothing short of a mess. Barbara Kamal's government clings to life. The Soviets are beginning their clash with the rebels. Major powers pour money into Pakistani ISI, and foreign fighters come from abroad to fight in the war. Join us in our next video, where we continue the Afghan story to its conclusion in what is one of the bloodiest wars of the latter 20th century. It is your likes, shares and subscriptions that allow us to continue producing quality content. Without your support, we would not exist.